Okay, y'all know that I've worked on this for a very, very long time. And the more and more that I look at everything around this case, the more questions arise and possible answers to those questions begin to come into play. And I'm going to start with this timeline here for Dylan and things that I think are really important in this timeline. At 4:25:16, that's when Dylan gets the last text from Bethany telling her to come down. It's better than being alone. And when I follow the timeline progression, it perfectly fits with 44 seconds later, we hear a car door shut on the 1112 camera. I believe that's absolute proof that Dylan and probably Bethany as well both went out that front door and got in a car and began using their phone, because we know Dylan's phone was about to die up in the room. So she goes out and gets in somebody's car, plugs in her charger, makes sense to me. And then she begins making calls. And the one that I feel like is the biggest red flag in the entire case is the 4:27:11 call that would have been made just a minute and 11 seconds later, that she makes on an Apple FaceTime call to an unknown individual. And I find that really odd because as we go through the released document that shows all of Dylan's phone activity that night, and we get to that 4:27:11, I had to do research to even figure out it was an Apple FaceTime call. And I believe they should have been able to figure out who she made an Apple FaceTime call to, even based on call records, in my opinion. So that should have been an identified person that we should have been able to see who she made that call to, but they left it off there. And the defense allowed them to leave it off there. So I find that to be very shady. But it's my humble opinion that if we could see who she made that FaceTime call to, it would, no doubt in my mind, based on everything else that I've seen, be the person who's driving the black Ford Explorer. Because after that, and that's about a 19-second call, then Dylan makes two Snapchat messages to Ethan. Then 7 seconds later, she calls Kaylee. 7 seconds later, she calls Xana. And then 14 seconds later, the black Ford Explorer is pulling in the driveway. And then Dylan's phone activity at that point stops for almost 4 minutes. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward progression. Bethany says, come down here. 45 seconds later, we hear a door shut in front of the King Road residence. Then all of a sudden, a call's made to somebody on FaceTime, then Snapchats to Ethan, calls to Kaylee and Xana. The Ford pulls up, and then nothing happens for 4 minutes. It tells me that that Ford pulled up and got with those girls. And then a 4 minute time lapse happens. And then at 4:32:57, Dylan makes one last text to Kaylee saying, please answer. And then her phone goes silent for almost 30 minutes. And then her activity begins again at 5 a.m. and then continues on all morning. So we've got a 30-minute pretty much gap between 4:32:57 when she sends the last text and 5 a.m. Y'all know I believe at this point her and Bethany goes to Emily and Josie's place. And that would account for that 30-minute gap before her phone activity starts back up. But it's this 4 minutes in between that last text to Kaylee and when the black Ford pulls in that I think proves that the person in the black Ford is somebody that is involved in what happened after this atrocity in probably more ways than we know. And I believe that person is the person she called at 4:27:11 that they're not identifying to us for some reason. So let's look at the evidence we have around this. First of all, of course, I have to go back in time because people want to question the Ford Explorer being the one that pulls in. Here recently, I've heard claims that it's the maroon Chevy Tahoe, and I'll prove real quick that that's impossible because I've slowed down and taken screenshots of when the Ford Explorer pulls into the neighborhood, and you can see I froze it right here, and you can clearly see the curved front of this sport utility as it comes in, matching the Ford Explorer perfectly. This maroon Chevy Tahoe has a flat front. As you see here, it's not curved at all, and its headlights don't go around the sides as you see here. And that's not all. And once again, you see how the headlights go around the side here. This is a obvious curve on the front of this vehicle. This is flat. Then the thing that they're pointing to say, well, it's not the Ford Explorer, is this rear tail light, because you can just see the square here. Well, when you look at the way the Ford Explorer's rear tail light is configured, it's configured in two parts here. And you can see there is a lamp here, and then there is a lamp back here. So when you look at it from the side, the only thing you're going to see illuminating is this side lamp, which is going to give you this square look right here. Another thing that I'll point out, when you look at it from this angle, you can just see the rear tail light barely right here, just like you would see from that angle, but you can clearly see the luggage rack on top of the vehicle right here. Once again, I've got the rear tail lights, but just to prove, well, I have to prove the luggage rack here in a minute, I guess. Okay, so when you look at this old Tahoe right here, you can see that it's got a long tail light that goes like this, just like you see in this picture of this one right here. And when you see the back of it, right here, I got the screenshot, you can see the tail light comes out, comes all the way down and over, just like you see in this depiction and this depiction, versus the Explorer, as it's pulling through, you're just seeing this square, which is this portion with this lamp. And I caught a still as it goes underneath the porch, and I mean, this should quiet any kind of dissension on it. You can clearly see the angle of the headlight, as it comes around. I mean, it's the Ford Explorer. And then you can just see the square here, which is again just this portion, but you see how this comes around and it's not exactly square. It kind of comes back just a little bit and comes around. When you look at this, it goes like, it looks like it's square because you're just seeing the light illuminate, but you can even see the indentation right here in the bottom where it's coming around. It's the Ford Explorer. There's the 424 vehicle as it's leaving, and I got the view of its tail lights, and I'll work on that later. But again, when you think about, like, for instance, Eric Gower's statement that he didn't see the Ford Explorer in the driveway when he came home. But then again, Eric Gower said he didn't see the red Jeep either. He said there was 4 vehicles, the red Jeep wasn't there, and he thought he saw the Ford Explorer. Well, the red Jeep never pulls in the neighborhood, so we know it was there. So if he saw 4 vehicles, it was either those 4 or those 4, and the Jeep was already there, so we can eliminate it, and we can eliminate the Ford Explorer being in the driveway when he was there. But also, it's this Mendoza line, I call it, right here. You see, when this vehicle pulls in the driveway, you can't see it in the third window of the house down here, which tells you it pulled in the driveway because of that. When Eric Gower brings Kaylee and Maddie home, he pulls in the driveway, and you cannot see the reflection in the mirror or in the windows when he pulls in the driveway either. However, when Eric Gower turns around and pulls out of the driveway, if he was to pull out to the right of this Mendoza line, just like when he pulled in, you would not see his reflection in those windows, but you do see it clearly, which means when Eric Gower pulled out, he had to pull out past this Mendoza line this way, and he could not have even pulled out and showed up in those windows if the Ford Explorer was there at that time. That is literal proof that the Ford Explorer was not there when Eric Gower was there, and we know it pulls in at 429 and it never leaves because you still see it sitting there to this day. So no doubt, 1000%, the Ford Explorer is the vehicle that pulls in at 429. This one right here is impossible. So every now and again, I get dissenters that want to try to pick things apart, and sorry, they're not going to pick this one apart. Next, again, it's the Mendoza line of when the tail lights and headlights can be seen in the window of this house over here. And this is the Mendoza line. When vehicles pull in, you can't see it, but if they were to pull out right here, you could, just like when Eric Gower did it. So that Ford Explorer pulls in and it never leaves, and it's still sitting in that parking lot a long time after the atrocity. So, oh yeah, once again, you've got the luggage rack, and on the Tahoe, you can see the Tahoe does not have a luggage rack at all, so it can't be the Tahoe. So we'll dispel that one first, because that's important, because that throws everything off in the case if you don't get that right. So now I'm going to move over to the next evidence that we'll talk about, and it's a critical piece of evidence that we're all familiar with, and it's who made the L4 footprint, and more importantly, who cleaned it up. And whoever did clean up the L4 footprint is most likely responsible for cleaning up all the footprints in the house that were likely tracked from Zan and Ethan's room through the area where, Dylan's room has been cleaned up the staircase, probably all the way to Maddie and Kaylee where they were found. And that's why we don't see anything on the floors. So that would be a big reason why everybody gets the crime scene wrong, because there wouldn't be any evidence of them carrying Kaylee back upstairs either, because in my opinion, somebody after the fact may have unwittingly tracked blood throughout this house and then was forced to clean it up because they went in and absolutely annihilated a crime scene. But it's this footprint right here that I think you're going to find really interesting, because I've been working on it for a while, and I've got one of my followers named Ken that has told me for over a year now, what about the big footprints, Pav? Well, I'm about to show you some really interesting things about the footprints in this one. Whoever did it likely cleaned up the entire floors in the house. That's why it's important for me to separate the floors and what you saw on the walls. But this particular pattern of this shoe has always made us want to think the shoe print is going this way because of the pattern of the shoe. But I'm going to show you something here. First of all, when you look at it from this perspective, you see exactly how big that little area was, and it wasn't really that big in comparison to this probably 36-inch or 32-inch wide door opening. So it's just this little area right here. And what I've found is when I go through and I look at this, it is likely not actually facing this way as previously thought. And I'll show you why I say that. Because who made these large footprints in the snow that go to the house and then come from the house? That is the next question. But more importantly, why did law enforcement not include this in their events of what took place with the crime? They claim that Kohberger comes out of the rear slider and goes up to his car this way, then they had two scenarios. One comes up this way, the other one was coming around and getting into it around that way. But either way, he left the rear slider and he headed this way. Never once do they claim Kohberger even headed this way or came in that way. So that means they're ignoring this evidence from the case altogether. Why would they do that when you clearly have footprints walking to and from a house found by law enforcement upon their arrival? And they went through a lot of steps. They measured these things. They marked them as evidence. I mean, this was a big piece of evidence that they just excluded from the entire case against Brian Kohberger. Is it because they knew it was a perpetrator and they wanted to keep the one perp theory going? Or is it because they knew who created these footprints and they knew why they created these footprints? And they also knew who created the footprints in the house later on, because they did not include the L4 fingerprint in their evidence against Kohberger either. So they knew who made these footprints, which in turn means they knew who cleaned them up, yet no charges were filed. Now, who was it that made these footprints? Who made these things? Well, a closer look at this particular print, I think, gives us a whole new perspective on things in this case. Now, do you see what I'm seeing when you look at this footprint closely? You see, when you look at it from this position, it's very interesting. You know, it looks like there's these squares and these little circles in the middle of the squares. And you got to remember, a footprint impression in the snow is kind of reverse. So where you see these little circles in the middle of the squares, well, that means on the bottom of the shoe, those actually are indentions in the shoe that's leaving the impression in the snow. So what you really have on the bottom of this shoe is whatever has made these squares right here. However, if you were to take your head as you look at this print and turn it kind of sideways, go ahead and turn your head, tilt it to the right on your neck and look at this same print. And look at it from this direction and tell me what you see. Do you see it? It's right there. Do you see it? You see the diamonds? Same diamond pattern. I mean, I've looked at it 1,000 times, matched it up 8 ways to Sunday. It is the diamond pattern that you find on the floor next to Dylan's door. And there is no doubt about it. And look what I'm able to do now that I've figured this out. You see down here, here's a better picture of it kind of zoomed in. You can clearly see the diamond pattern in the print. And when you zoom in a little bit more, it really gives you the same representation of the pattern in this shoe print as you see right here at Dylan's door. I'm going to let you stare at that for a minute. Whoever made the prints in the snow made the bloody footprint near Dylan's door. And law enforcement ignores this altogether. But what I was able to extrapolate from this, though, is when you go down here and you take this full impression of this shoe print and you draw an angle line going right alongside the footprint, so you know the direction of travel that the person was taking. But then you take another line and you follow the diamond pattern. So this line goes along the side of the shoe. This line follows the diamond pattern. And then you repeat this process on the same print, L4, and you just don't move. You don't move this line. I lined up the diamond patterns, and then I kept this line exactly the same and just transferred it over to this particular print, which in turn I took this angle of this arrow and then I put it on this same print. And then I took a triangle and I got as perfect to that angle as I possibly could. And the reason that I did this is because this shows us the angle that this footprint was actually made. So you can see that this footprint from this angle, when you overlay it to this photo, shows that the foot was actually facing this direction right here. This is the angle, but this is the direction that the foot was facing, which means that partially this foot was on this side of the threshold and it crosses the threshold. Number one, but number two, this is a big old foot. Not just big in length, it's big in width. So I think about this and I start trying to put things together and I come up with this hypothesis. If, for example, we were to take the Ford Explorer that pulls in at 429 and we kind of follow through a progression that I started out with in the beginning, right? Dylan runs to Bethany's room. 45 seconds later, you hear a door shut in front of the residence that I speculated was Dylan and probably Bethany getting in a car. And then Dylan begins using her phone, makes a FaceTime call to somebody. And then a couple of minutes later, we get this Ford Explorer that pulls into the driveway. Well, if the person driving that was to get out and then continue walking down, and there's a almost 4-minute gap in phone activity right here when Dylan's phone stopped doing anything for 4 minutes for some reason. Just enough time for somebody to have a conversation with them, and they say, I think everybody in the house has been whacked. And if this person is a brave person and really cares about the people in the house, and he says, all right, let me go check things out. And maybe she lets him know she thinks the person went out the rear slider. So instead of going through the front door, he decides to be a little sly about it. So he goes around the house. As you see, the footprints in the snow tells the tale. And he comes up and he goes through the rear sliding door. And if he has, let's just say, real strong feelings for, like, say, Ethan, then he would go directly in, probably through blood on the floor, around to Ethan and Xana's room and realize what he's seeing in there. And I'm sure he would be very distraught, and knowing how much he cares about Ethan, if this person did care about Ethan, then seeing him like he was, naked and in the shape that he was in, I would think that he couldn't take it, and he'd probably get a blanket and cover Ethan up, just like they found when they found the bodies. And then from that point, he would want to go check on the others, but he couldn't be 100% sure there wasn't people still in the house. So if he left there and went to go walk upstairs and he came to, say, Dylan's room and Dylan's door was shut, well, he would obviously want to check and make sure nobody was hiding in Dylan's room before he went past that. So the logical thing to do would be open the door and take a step inside to make sure nobody was in there before continuing on upstairs, leaving a footprint in the process. And then continue on upstairs, again, probably further tracking blood, going in and checking Maddie and Kaylee and figuring out what happened there, maybe even putting a blanket over them before returning back downstairs and then heading out that rear slider. Except at this point, he would run into something that he wouldn't have been anticipating, which would have been a barking Murphy outside, uncontrollably barking. So what would that person do with Murphy if I contemplate this out? Well, they would likely get Murphy, and they couldn't take him back inside because everybody inside has been unalive. So what do you do with him? Well, knowing who Murphy belonged to, he would think quick on his feet and say, I'll just take him to his other owner. And at that point would walk, just like you see the footprints, up past the fence area of the next door neighbors, and then right around to the owner of Murphy's residence and say, here's Murphy, everybody in the house has been attacked. And then when I think about that, and I think about Murphy, because we see Murphy on camera 2 times. Roughly an hour apart from each other, both in this area right here, later on that morning. And I always contemplated that when Murphy got out, he just made his way over here, and then that was Murphy just kind of running around. But the fact that we only see him twice right here, and it's about an hour apart both times, makes me believe that the person that has Murphy is letting him out to use the bathroom, and Murphy just goes to his normal spot where he uses the bathroom, and then comes back. Hour later, they do it again, and he comes back. which makes perfect sense to me. And also means that whoever tracked that blood all over that house that may have taken Murphy over here to Jack D's would likely be involved with whoever brought Murphy back into the house before the 911 call and cleaned up all that blood in between those rooms because they had tracked it through their house with their big giant shoe prints. Now, who around this case would have that kind of, I don't know, compassion for the victims, be close enough to them to do everything that I just talked about, and also have access to a black Ford Explorer that we see in the driveway, but also be large enough to have big, gigantic feet like you see measured in that snow. I mean, who fits all of this? I don't know. I could speculate. Let me think about who is big around this case that could make these giant footprints. When I think of Ethan, I go, man, Ethan is 6'4". He's a very tall, very large individual. So I draw this line right across the top of Ethan's head. And I go, well, dang, wait a minute. His sister isn't tall enough. Her little feet didn't make it. And his mom and dad wasn't there, and they're short. Whoa, look at this dude. Who is this? I don't even know who this is in this picture. But goodness, he's another couple inches taller than Ethan. Heck, this dude's 6'6". Yeah, let's check out. Goodness, look at the width and depth of these feet. They're huge. Oh my goodness. I guess we need to figure out if we can identify this person and see if they had shoes that match that diamond pattern. Because if they do, then I think it would put my case together on who this call was made to that was driving this Ford Explorer and had those big old feeties. And does that person, can we verify their whereabouts? Like, can we get their phone and make sure that their phone did not receive that call or did not travel to the King Road residence? Is their phone available? If not, then I think we've got a pretty good case to make here.